Often, policymakers will come up with an idea that everyone thinks is great, yet it fails. Not because the problem wasn't solvable, not because the wrong tool was chosen, but because it was never implemented properly. Policy implementation is an often overlooked but crucial element that determines policy success. So, beyond just hoping for success, what actually determines if a policy will be implemented successfully? In this video, I'll break down the key ingredients of successful implementation using the framework of Sabatier and Mazmanian, and then show why the war on drugs was an unmitigated failure. Because if you have a solution to a problem, but you can't implement it, well, you don't really have a solution at all. By the way, if this is your first time watching, I'm Seamus. I've spent the past decade working in Canada's public service after studying both public policy and economics. I make videos to help you better understand how public policies are made and what their impact really is. Sometimes called misery research because of the daunting list of possible variables, the study of policy implementation really began in earnest in the 1970s. For example, one of the first serious studies of implementation looked at a $23 million urban redevelopment program in Oakland, California. It was a program that had wide political support, had money in place, and had a relatively straightforward goal. Yet, after 3 years, only $3 million of the $23 million program had been spent on a single highway redevelopment. The failure in this early study was explained by the sheer number of decision points. Every permit, every approval, every sign-off was a chance for implementation to be blocked. But it's not quite as stark as this early study would suggest. That's because each of these decisions are not really independent decisions. Agencies coordinate, priorities align, and people generally want to be accommodating. So, if that's only a partially satisfactory explanation of why this program was a failure, what is a better one? Well, this is where Sabatier and Mazmanian come in. They went beyond just decision points and put the keys to success in 3 broad buckets. It's these 3 buckets that determine whether a policy is successfully implemented. First, we look at what they call the tractability of the problem. In other words, sort of how hard is the problem to solve. Successful implementation is more likely when the cause and effect relationships are well understood, a narrow range of behaviors is being targeted, the required change is relatively small, and the population is smaller. Let's compare 2 policies. First, requiring people to wear seatbelts to save lives versus increasing activity levels to improve heart health to also save lives. Same ultimate goal, but 2 very different problems in terms of their tractability. The seatbelt policy is much easier to implement. The cause and effect mechanism is well understood. The fact that you're wearing a seatbelt stops you from flying through the windshield, whereas the cause and effect relationship between activity levels and heart health is understood. There are a lot of other complex factors that influence this relationship. With seatbelts, you're trying to get people to click in whenever they get into a vehicle. That's about as narrow a set of behavior as you can really get. For increasing activity levels, there's a number of different behaviors that you could be looking at. So, participation in recreational sports, active transportation, just encouraging people to take the stairs, right? There's a lot of different behaviors that we could be looking at when we're thinking about increasing activity levels. Now, is it a smaller population that drives cars versus needs to increase their activity levels? Honestly, not too sure, but the point remains, and I think it's fairly obvious, that it's easier in general to ask people to wear seatbelts when they drive cars instead of increase their activity levels. The second bucket is how well is the agency designed? For successful implementation, there should be clear objectives, adequate resources for the implementing agency, strong lines of accountability, minimum points where outside agencies can veto the actions of the implementing agency, and external communications should be skewed towards supporters of implementation rather than critics of implementation. So, coming back to the seatbelt example from before, the objective needs to be clear that the goal is more people wearing seatbelts, not just more broadly safer cars or safer transportation. There needs to be a large enough budget to have enough traffic officers enforcing the new rule. There needs to be a clearly accountable agency, in this case, the police. There can't be other agencies getting in the way. For example, regulators of car manufacturers can't prohibit seatbelts being placed in cars. And finally, the traffic police can't spend too much time with the automobile industry and not listen to safety advocates, because that will skew the implementation of the policy away from the original objective. Finally, the third bucket is, does the world outside of the agency support the implementation of the policy? This means ongoing political support, public buy-in, and favorable economic conditions. Again, seatbelt rules won't really lead to increased safety if there's no willingness from the public to wear seatbelts, and politicians aren't willing to support the police in enforcing it, or if the economic conditions are such that nobody can afford to buy cars that have seatbelts. Okay, you get the idea. A policy needs ongoing political support, public buy-in, and the necessary economic conditions to succeed. And so these three buckets together show why successful implementation of a policy might not be as guaranteed as we might hope, because it requires a problem that can be realistically solved, an agency that has the tools it needs to be successful, and a political and economic environment that supports successful implementation. Now let's get into the issue I promised at the start of this video, why the war on drugs failed. And it's a great example because it failed all three dimensions. So first, tractability. The war on drugs was trying to change complex human behavior across millions of people. It never properly identified the cause of either drug use or the supply of drugs, and asked people to make huge changes. It asked drug users to overcome addiction, and asked suppliers to give up their livelihoods. And there are a lot of people globally who consume or sell drugs. So it was never an easy problem to solve, or in academic terms, the tractability of the problem was very low. Secondly, the institutional design was very poor. There was fragmented implementation across international, national, state, and local police forces, healthcare systems, schools, and courts and prisons, among others. It was an extremely long list of organizations that were involved in the war on drugs, often with overlapping and unclear roles. Further, these organizations were often trying to meet other objectives at the same time, which took them away from this goal of the war on drugs. No single actor had both the authority and the incentive to ensure success. Finally, the political and economic environment did not support the implementation of the policies around the war on drugs. The political environment eroded over the long term, and the economic incentives driving the drug trade never disappeared. Plus, the support from those involved in the drug trade was never there to begin with. They consistently resisted implementation. The goals of the war on drugs, reducing harm and preventing addictions, were widely supported. But policy success isn't just about having admirable objectives. And without a tractable problem, a coherent institutional design, and a supportive environment, even the most well-intentioned policies don't just struggle, they outright fail. So if you're ever tasked with implementing a policy, don't just ask whether it's a good idea. Ask whether it can actually be implemented using these three dimensions, because that's where policy success is really determined. That's it from me today. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.